Hello, we're at the Walker Art Center for a Regis dialogue with William Klein, a filmmaker, photographer, painter, indeed a multifaceted artist, and everything but a conformist. William Klein is an American who has lived in Paris for nearly 60 years. From this place of distance, he often looks closely at the United States of America through his photographs and films. Tonight, we will discuss his exploration of the eccentric, the out of the ordinary, what he finds as he explores behind the scenes. He seeks not to please, but rather to provoke, with wit and humor. A true artist, Klein has sought his own voice far from the mainstream. The magic of his films is that they not only portrayed their time, but also foresaw the truths of the future. I'm Paulina del Paso, filmmaker and associate programmer for FICO, the Mexico City International Contemporary Film Festival. I will be your guide through William Klein's work. Let's start the Regis dialogue with William Klein. Hello everyone. First of all, I would just like to thank the Walker Art Center for their generous invitation, and of course, William Klein for this invitation. Broadway by light, I guess this brings back memories to you.
Everything brings back memories. You too.
Great, thank you. You were born in New York in 1928.
Right.
Tell me about this. How was it?
That was great.
Well, what was New York like at the time?
I didn't feel a thing. What was New York like?
What was New York like at the time?
It was the same piece of shit it is today.
But I mean, it was different. So you were in an Irish neighborhood? Yes, Jewish family?
New York is one-fourth Irish, 1/4 Italian, 1/4 Jewish and black. And I went to school right next to an Irish parochial school, and the Irish and the Jews didn't get along very well together, and there were many fights in the streets. Why do you want to know this?
Well, I think your background has a lot to do with where you're coming from and the films you make. So
yeah, I don't know.
You were a clever kid. I know you were a clever kid. That's what I've read.
I was a clever kid. Yeah. Well, that's over.
And I know you were interested in art. When did you start being interested in art?
Well, I guess all the time. You know, if you can draw, it was one of the best courses you can have in school. Art, history, and drawing, and so on. And when I was a kid, you know, since I was like 12 years old, I always dreamt of being an artist in Paris and going to the Le Coupole and clapping Picasso on the back and Giacometti and everything. And it happened. It happened, but I didn't clap Picasso on the back, but I did come to Paris. And thanks to the United States Army, I was drafted and went to Europe. It was right after the war, and I was in the occupation in Germany. And there was a moment when the American Army was looking through the records of soldiers in Germany, and they had a program of Franco-American friendship. And they sent 25 soldiers to Paris during their military service to go to the Sorbonne and to study existentialism and other things. And so I was in Paris thanks to the army, and I met a girl.
The love of your life. Tell me about this.
The love of my life, yes. Well, when I was in Paris, we had the opportunity of having bicycles from the Red Cross, and I was cycling around Paris all the time, looking for places that I had read about in books. And at one point I saw the most beautiful girl in the world, and I stopped the bike and I asked her, where is the École de Beaux-Arts? I had just come from there. And she started to explain, and I was watching her. I never saw anybody so beautiful. And she explained, and I said, what are you doing tonight? and we went to the movies, and we stayed together for 50 years.
Jeanne Florin, she was your collaborator and helped you with the costumes in your films.
She did everything. She was a painter herself, and when directors do movies, they always think that the producers don't know what they're doing, and many directors form their own film company. That's one thing I did at one point, and had a film company, and actually I thought I knew much more than the producers did about making films, but there's so much red tape producing films in France that it's really a ball breaker to have a production company. Because, in Belgium, for example, if you have a film company and you do a film, that's cool. But when the film is over, you can close down the film company and there's no problem. In France, you have to keep paying the patent, the permission to have this film company, and it costs a lot of money and a lot of red tape. And so who became the president of my film company is my wife. And she knew nothing about that kind of business either, but she is very smart, and she learned, and she did that sort of thing much better than I did.
But before you got into making films, you did study painting with Fernand Leger. Tell me a bit about this.
Well, this is also the American Army. There was something called the GI Bill of Rights. If you were in the Army and you wasted 2 years of your life being in the Army, as a sort of compensation, the government would finance 2 years of study that you'd missed out on, and people could go back to the university or whatever. And I had the possibility of doing what I always dreamt about. I got discharged in Paris, and I wanted to be a painter in Paris. And we had the choice of places to study painting, which was the École de Beaux-Arts, the famous école that I asked my wife about, La Grande Chaumière, André Lotte, who was a famous theoretician painting, and Fernand Leger, who had a studio. So for several of us, there was no hesitation. To go to Fernand Leger's studio was a miracle. And so I went there, and I met Leger, and we were all like 21 years old in Paris, in the studio of a famous artist. And it was the first artist, real artist, that any of us encountered. And Leger was like, I wouldn't say a father to us, but he was a father figure. And we would ask questions of him like little boys would ask their uncle or their grandfather. We'd say, look, Monsieur Leger, you spent part of the war in America. You were in New York, and you're a communist. You were in Moscow as well. what do you prefer, New York or Moscow? And he said, well, listen, I'm much closer to what is going on in Moscow, but New York is more fun.
I believe he said that you should go out into the streets, something like that.
Well, you know, a lot of people confuse that sort of thing. Leger said you should go out of the studio, generally. Painters, you know, he saw all these bourgeois, aspiring artists, and everybody wanted to latch onto a gallery and sell paintings and be famous. And he calmed us down, and he said, look, galleries, museums, curators, it's all bullshit. What you want to do is really know about the role of the artist in the city and look at 14th century painting, painters working with architects, and this is what you should try to do. And in France that was impossible because at that time France had no structure of collaboration with architects. There was no French architects like there are today. Very old-fashioned notions of building, and I'd been to Italy, and I'd seen that at that time there was the Italian boom, economic boom, and they were building like crazy, and there were a lot of famous architects, and I did a show where I showed mural projects, and I was lucky. There was somebody who came to see the exhibition opening, and he was a young architect. And he said, I have a project, I have a commission, and I invented a thing. It's a room divider. There's 6 panels. They're on rails. They can separate a big space like here, and then they can go on the rails and become a mural on the wall. He said, I have this thing I have to do. How would you like to paint it on both sides? And you know, it was a miracle. I went to Italy to have a show. I was like 22 years old, and here I was getting a commission to do something that I couldn't have dreamt that I would be able to do, and I did it. And I worked for this architect for several weeks, and I did these paintings. And he was close to a magazine called Domus, which was a very famous magazine. Everybody knew this magazine, but nobody knew how it was made. And this is Europe, you know, and this was Milano. Despite the fact that there was a boom, it was done on a shoestring. There were just 3 people working in the magazine, but the magazine was sold all over the world, and I did, and they published these paintings that I did with an architect, and it was the beginning of something I wanted to do, and so I had the possibility of doing some other mural works with architects, but more I got into it, I realized that I came to think that really working on something that was already finished, the architecture and so on, and a painting, a structure was done when everything else was already imagined and done. And I thought, well, the thing to do is become an architect. But you know, to become an architect is 6 years of study, and I was in a hurry, like all kids. And
so that's when you became a photographer, then?
Well, what happened is I photographed these murals. I had a Rolleiflex and I had a tripod, and I photographed these panels. And what was interesting is that these panels turned. They were painted on both sides, and I photographed the design, and I had somebody flip the panels while the long exposures were made, and it gave me an idea of getting out of a abstract geometrical painting that I was doing at the time, and the long exposure gave a blur to these triangles, squares, and circles. And I thought, well, this is maybe a new way of treating graphic elements and the blur. And I had the possibility of photographing, printing, and doing experiments with abstract photography in a darkroom. And these are my first real photographs. But the fact is, I had a darkroom, and I realized that a lot of the photographs that I took on vacation, photographs of my wife and everything, when I enlarged them myself, they were much better than the photographs that came back from the corner drugstore, which were out of focus, had thumb marks on it. And I was excited by the idea of photography as a way of getting out of the studio and talking about life, things that I saw, and the way I saw them. And I thought, well, I was in Paris, and the dream of clapping Picasso and Giacometti on the shoulder never came true. But I had a couple of friends who were in Paris at that time, Americans, and we all had this sort of disappointment of this Paris that we dreamt about, Paris of the 30s and 20s, which was the center of the art world. We realized that nothing much was happening. Paris was kind of shell shock after the war, and nothing much was happening. And I thought, we thought that we should look elsewhere, and we started to look at what the Russian constructivists were doing, and the Bauhaus, which was closer to us. And the Bauhaus was in Germany in the 30s and 20s, and in the Bauhaus there was this notion of multidisciplinary work, graphic design, typography, layout, and even movies and photography. And so I thought the idea of painting alone was maybe old-fashioned in a way, and I should look elsewhere and try to do things in that direction. And once I had the possibility of working on my photographs, I had this idea of going back to New York and doing a book on my return to New York. You know, it was when I was about 24, 25, and you know, when you're that age, you think you can do anything. And I had no complexes, I had no photographic training, but I knew that I could do something with a photograph once I had a negative in my hand and an enlarger, and I could really make up for my lack of formal training by bringing to the photographs some of the things I learned when I was a painter. Well, you people don't know about this, but there is a tradition in America where people who take photographs or do drawings or whatever, they are very much influenced by publications. There were two publications which were fashion magazines. There was Vogue and Harper's Bazaar, And for women at that time, these magazines were their monthly dose of culture, because Vogue was not only a magazine that showed dresses, they also talked about literature, theater, and art. And curiously enough, the director of Vogue and the director of Harper's Bazaar were Russian Jewish refugees from revolutionary Russia. And they were the ones who really created these avant-garde magazines. Avant-garde, they were commercial magazines, but they were the first people who published, you know, Brassai and Cartier-Bresson and even a Mexican called Covarrubias.
Oh, really?
Do you know him?
Yeah.
He was under contract for Vogue, can you imagine?
And so when did you start taking photos for Vogue?
Well, anyhow, I had this show in Paris, and Lieberman called me up, and he said, would you come and see me in my office? And I went, and he said, how would you like to work for Vogue? And I said, doing what? And he said, I don't know, we'll see. You can be assistant art director. I like what you're doing, and I'm interested in young talents and so on. And I can give you a contract, and you could work for Vogue. Doing what? You can do portraits, you can do still lifes, you can do some reportage. And there I was without any formal training, never gone to school, learning about photography. And I had a contract, you know, for an enormous sum of money that at that time was $150 a week, you know. And for me, this was like a fortune. And I was able to live on that, and my wife also. And so I was under contract for Vogue. And then he said, do you have a project in photography? And I said, yes. I'd like to go back to New York and do a book on my return to New York, because I felt I would see New York differently. As a native, you know, a street spot New Yorker, and one-eye European. And he said, okay, you do that, we'll finance the photography, and we'll publish a portfolio now and then. And that was my first contact with commercial work, and it was a tremendous plus. I mean, I wanted to do these photos of New York, but I mean, photography was expensive, was expensive, much cheaper nowadays with digital photography. You can take 500 photographs for nothing, but when you do film and you develop it and you do enlargements, I mean, paper, everything is very expensive. And it was paid for me by Vogue. I was really very lucky. And I did this book on New York. Well, I did photographs for the book, and it was thanks to Lieberman. But when I went to editors in New York and I showed these photographs, they said, what kind of New York is this? You make New York look like a slum. And I said, well, New York is a slum. And what do you know about New York? You live on Fifth Avenue, you come to the office on Madison Avenue. You've never been to the Bronx, you don't know anything about the Queens or anything. Anyhow, and they say, yeah, well, the photographs are shit. I said, that's what you think. I think these photographs are interesting. And well, I never found an American editor. And when I went back to France, I started looking around, and I discovered that there was a publication called La Petite Planète. And it was these are like travel books for people, hip kids. And I saw the guy who was doing it was called Chris Marker. I don't know whether you know him. but you should. He's a filmmaker, he's a writer, and a photographer, and he was running this magazine as part of a big publishing house. And I showed him the photographs, and he said, we will publish the book, and if we don't publish the book, I quit this publishing house. And since he was their Wunderkind, he was somebody that they were very proud of, and he was threatening to quit every month, and they went along with this, you know. And nobody really liked the photographs, the people in this publishing house, except him and a couple of other people. But I must say that the photograph, in fact, I quote somebody from the Museum of Modern Art called John Shorkowski, who was the curator of photography. He said Klein's photographs at the time were not very easy to like, and even today they are photographs that are hard to take. And anyhow, a lot of people had that reaction, but the book came out, and it had a lot of repercussion for and against, and it won a prize. It won the prize for the best photographic book of the year. And
but can we go to your first feature film?
This was my first film. It was 1958. It was the first film I did, and it was a lot of people. I mean, it is the first pop film, and it was a film I did a little bit in reaction to the book, because the book was very harsh, black and white, and grunge. And I thought, you know, a lot of people criticized that, but I didn't really pay attention to them. And I thought I would do well, talking about films. So we talk about Chris Marker, who was a filmmaker, and he had a good friend. You know, they were like almost twins, who was Alain Resnais, who was a great film director in Paris. And they were obsessed with America. I was like their American mascot, you know. They had not been to New York, any of them. At that time, you didn't travel so easily. Plane trips were expensive, and so they dug my photographs. They dug the take I had on America and New York, and Alain Resnais, he said, well, now you've done a photographic book, now you should do movies. And why not? This is what I wanted to do. And I did this film on Broadway, which was, for me, the ABC of making movies. Because for me, you know, the word ready-made, which was a concept of Marcel Duchamp, and I thought the New York electric lights and whatever, neons, were ready-mades. All I would have to do would film the cycles of these ads, and I thought I'd be saying the same thing that I did in the book, because in the book I showed a New York that was not the Big Apple, but a New York that was kind of tragic. I knew this from my family. I knew my father, you know, he really worked his ass off to make a few bucks, and he was like the death of a salesman. And I thought, filming the electric lights to show the most beautiful thing in New York, which was advertising. And these electric lights were beautiful. And the contrary of the New York book, who was really kind of harsh and grunge. But it said the same thing, because it's the obsession of of commercial brainwashing. I mean, you saw the ads, you know, for Kleenex or Sylvania or whatever, and you saw these things, and everybody who came to New York would go to 42nd Street and look up in the air and say how wonderful everything is, because they would see these commercials. And I thought I would do a film like that, and that's the first film I did. So you want to talk about Paulina Maggoo?
Yes.
Why is that?
Well, that's your first feature film, and it's quite a severe critique to the fashion world, which you had been working in with your photos.
Yeah, well, you know, I was working for Vogue, but I wasn't taking fashion photographs. I was taking doing these photographs of New York, and I was doing portraits and still lifes and so on for Vogue. And at one point, Lieberman said to me, look, we've been paying for all these things, and we're delighted to do that, because I think it's you've done really interesting work. But we're a fashion magazine. Why don't you try to take some fashion photographs? And I had no idea of how to take a fashion photograph, but I was more or less in that atmosphere, and I was looking at the magazines, and I was knocked out by the technique of these fashion photographers. And so when he said, why don't you try? And I said, okay. And he said, who are the models you like? And I had been looking through the magazine. I said, oh, this one, that one, that one. And so he got in the studio. There was 3 of the best models in New York. And I tried to take a fashion photograph. But, you know, I had no idea of how to go about it. And I did something so weird. But I mean, the models, they went along with that, because they said, who knows, maybe this guy will turn out to be somebody who we'll work with. So they went along with it. But Lieberman, once again, he said, look, I think you can figure out how to do some innovative fashion photography. Why don't you try to do photographs in Paris for the coming collections? And I thought a little bit about how fashion photography was kind of staid and mechanical, and the poses were kind of like a parody of ballet poses. And I thought that my experience in photography would give me ideas of how to get out of that rut of standard fashion photography. And I had the idea of using telephoto lenses and having the girls in traffic, in the architecture, on the rooftops and so on, in Paris for these collections. And my first photographs were, fashion photographs, were photographs in that style. Telephoto lenses, girls lost in traffic and hardly posing. And so that's what I did.
But how about if we see a little extract of Maggoo and then we can get into that theme?
You want to see something from Maggoo? Okay.
Yeah, we're going to see the beginning of Maggoo. Maggoo is the story of this top model who is being filmed for this TV program, Who Are You? And so we're going to see the very beginning. It's the backstage of a fashion show. And if we could see it, please, that would be great.
Jean-Loup, Daniel, enfin bref, le coffre, je t'ai déjà dit comme un œuf. Non, rien, ne dépasse pas que moi tout ce que je fais. Comme un œuf. Passe-moi les cisailles. Ah, ma grande. Toi, tu sais ce que t'as à faire, hein. Tu tournes, tu planes et tu t'envoles. Voilà. Tu tournes, tu planes et tu t'envoles. Je comprends bien, tu répètes. Voilà. Ah, et puis alors, repasse pas deux fois, c'est pas la peine. Tout de suite, c'est pas la peine de repartir deux fois.
Ah, voilà, Miss Maxwell, quelle punaise. C'est laquelle est Bah, c'est la rédactrice en chef, tu l'as vu entrer.
Encore rien comprendre cette conne. Enfin, ça fait rien. Non, c'est parti. Oui, bon, ça suffit maintenant. C'est pas la peine de serrer tant que ça. Allez, ça va.
Numéro 1. Number 1. Numéro 1.
Oh, ça c'est absolument admirable, évidemment pas commode, mais que faire?
Oh, c'est étonnant. Oh, c'est beau, ça.
Fantastique.
Ça, c'est une beauté.
Oh, mais la femme est formidable.
Magnifique.
So here we see your great sense of humor, these extraordinary outfits. How did you come up with the idea of these outfits?
Well, I wanted to do a film on which dealt with brainwashing and bullshit in general. And so it was fashion, media, magazines, and so on. What people remember is the fashion element. And I had the idea of doing a film with a kind of model, Alice in Wonderland, who comes to Paris and who becomes the toast of Paris. And there was a model I worked with a lot. She was from Brooklyn. You people know where Brooklyn is? She was from Brooklyn. She was really Alice in Wonderland. She had no idea of where Paris was or anything. But she was a great model. And I thought you could be an actress. And I wrote the scenario, and she went back to New York, and I had a friend who worked at the Actors Studio, and he took her in hand, and she learned to be an actress, in a few months. And when she came back, we did the film. Now these dresses, in quotes, in aluminum, I thought, if I'm going to do a fashion show at the beginning of the film, I couldn't ask a fashion designer to do the dresses, because whatever he would do in 5 years would be old-fashioned and quaint. And so I had the idea of doing something completely unwearable and absurd. I had a couple of friends who were sculptors and who did musical instruments in aluminum. And I thought they're very beautiful, and why not make dresses out of these aluminum objects? And so that's what we did. And you saw, well, the beginning of the film backstage, and these girls are being dressed in aluminum dresses. And I thought, well, at least this is something that nobody's going to wear or rip off. But I was wrong, because that year you saw several fashion designers starting to work in metal, Paco Rabanne and Cassar and a couple of others. And the film came out in October, and for Christmas, all the big stores had windows, store windows, with models in silver foil or gold, and so on. And so the conclusion is that there's nothing too absurd for fashion. You do something which you think will not be ripped off or used. You're wrong. They're going to rip off everything. If you do dresses in shit, they're going to do dresses in shit. Anyhow, so that's a scene from the beginning of the film. And the film is about how this girl comes to Paris and has a lot of adventures. It's called Who Are You, Maggoo? I imagined a program, a TV program, a monthly program, where each different program would be about somebody. Who are you? So Maggoo, the model, is the object of the journalists for this film. And the next month it's the Pope. Who are you, Pope 12th, and so on. So it's the whole idea of everything is mixed together: models, popes, Gorbachev, Stalin, whatever. Zapata.
Zapata, yes.
Zapata. Who are you, Emiliano Zapata?
So just as you were groundbreaking with the costumes, you're also groundbreaking with your narrative. You have a very free narrative, especially in all your films, but jumping from animation and then to kind of cinéma vérité. And so I actually would like to show another extract from Maggoo, which I must confess, when I saw it the first time, it really took me by surprise. I was not expecting it, and I was just amazed. So I would like us to see this. It's kind of halfway through the story, I believe. So if we could see this next extract, please.
Le cas de Polly. Cheveux fins et fragiles de bébé, cassants et mous. La bière donne de la tenue, le citron de l'éclat. La bière aussi. Comment faire? Si les ailes de votre nez sont délicates et mobiles, et si elles sont capables de frémir comme les naseaux d'un cheval, alors vous êtes né sous le signe de la chance. Votre bouche est-elle grande, bien dessinée, droite, avec les coins légèrement relevés? Votre visage s'inscrit-il dans un cercle? Tout ce qui est rond est bon. Le sourcil est la clé de voûte de votre œil. Retrouvez l'équilibre de votre visage. Redistribuez vous-même ombres et lumières. Vous ne vous doutez pas de ce que peut être votre regard. Méfiez-vous. Vos yeux sont bavards. En un clin d'œil, ils disent tout. Adieu, rasoir.
Tout cela est à vous, ma chérie.
Tout?
Tout.
Merci.
Ce n'est rien. Venez. C'est la grande horloge. Il est 12h15. On entre par ici et on sort par là.
C'est magnifique.
C'est Paris, le 340 place de la Nation, le triomphe de la République par Dalou.
Et ça?
C'est la Seine, vue générale. Les brumes du matin se sont dissipées, il fait beau, 15 degrés, 10 à Lille et Angoulême et 19 à Draguignan. Sur votre gauche, le ciné univers.
Et tout ça là-bas?
C'est Paris 2, bis. C'est spécial.
Et ça alors?
Ça, c'est l'arrêt du 175 pont de Neuilly, fin de section.
Oh, c'est magnifique. Où sommes-nous?
À Suresnes.
Et tu habites ici?
Non, mais j'ai un château là-bas.
So how do you come up with these ideas?
You know, it's my first film. I thought if I'm doing a film, I'd have to really rework the whole idea of narrative, of what goes into images and the sequences and so on. So I really went berserk doing everything that was possible in movies in one film. So there was animation like this, there was many other things.
What did your contemporary French filmmakers think of Maggoo?
This film won the prize Jean Vigo. And Jean Vigo is like, it's like the Pulitzer Prize. Jean Vigo is a great filmmaker, and he had a style that was very corrosive and surrealistic. And each year they give a prize to a film which has those aspects in its construction and so on.
And I believe you were fired from Vogue at some point?
I was almost fired from Vogue when that film came out. But you know, that woman that came in, the fashion editor, was a take on Diana Vreeland. Now, Diana Vreeland, I don't know whether you know who she is, but she was the great editor of Harper's Bazaar and later Vogue. And she was revered. Nobody made fun of her except me. And it wasn't appreciated, but they wouldn't fire me for that reason because it would be too obvious. They fired me a little later.
Because of your...
because I did a film and
Far from Vietnam?
Far from Vietnam. It was a group film that was done with Alain René, Godard, Agnès Varda, Joris Evans, about the American intervention in Vietnam. And for some reason, there was a daily newspaper about fashion called Women's Wear Daily, and they had a big headline, famous Vogue photographer doing violent anti-American film. And they learned about this, and that was a real scandal, because that was done in 1967. The war in Vietnam was not popular, but it wasn't generally decried, and people were really shocked about the film that came out. We went to the New York Film Festival. I went with that film to the New York Film Festival, and there was a standing ovation after the film for 15 minutes. But in the newspapers, Variety and so on, they said I was a communist pawn, and here I was, an American in Paris, brainwashed by violent anti-American communist filmmakers. And at that point, my friend Alexander Lieberman invited me for lunch. And he said, now you're doing movies and you don't really need a Vogue contract, do you? And I said, well, you know, I'm doing okay. I don't really need the Vogue contract. And so he said, well, so that's it.
And I believe having made Far from Vietnam influenced you also for your next feature film, which was Mr. Freedom.
Yeah.
Where did the idea for Mr. Freedom come from?
Well, I was violently against the war in Vietnam, like a lot of people. And Far from Vietnam was an interesting movie experience, an interesting human experience and historic experience, because Chris Marker, once again, was contacted by revolutionary students in Paris who were organizing anti-Vietnam symposiums. And these kids said to him, listen, we try to get people to come to our meetings, and we show films, but the films are so lousy that nobody wants to come. So why don't you do a film that we can show? And he said, I'm not going to do a film, but I can get some of my friends who are movie directors to work on a film. And so he contacted these people, Godard, René, Agnès Varda, Joris Evans, and even Claude Lelouch. And he said, we'd like to do a film, and let's do a group film. And so we did that. And we worked on it for several months. We didn't know too much about the war in Vietnam. And we had meetings every week, and we had Vietnamese intellectuals and militants coming, talking to us about Vietnam and the war. And there were all kinds of historians who filled us in. And we started to learn about many things. And we, the six of us, you know, we still had no idea of how to do a film. I mean, we knew how to do a film, but we didn't have any idea of how to do a film that people would watch and come to see. And we did it for the Vietnamese. We did it for militant reasons. And we finally did a film which was a hodgepodge. There were documentary sequences, there was fictional sequences, and it was a strange mixture. But I thought it was frustrating because I wanted the film to be seen by a large public. And you know, people didn't rush to see documentary films, anti-war films. And so I had the idea that I would do a film which would be like a comic strip hero film, you know, like Spider-Man or Superman and so on. And I invented a character called Mr. Freedom. And Mr. Freedom was kind of a spatial Rambo coming to France to treat France like a third world country. So he was going to get rid of the red commies and the yellow Maoist influence, and that was the story. And I thought I would do this in a comic strip style, and so that's the film that I did.
Okay, I would like us to see an extract from
You would
Mr.
like to see
Freedom.
an extract?
Yes, I must say that there again you were groundbreaking. Nobody had ever created a character like this and such a satire. And so if we can go to this next clip, please.
Yeah, I was poor, dirt poor. I was born poor. My father worked in the sewers. Then came the Depression. They closed down the schools. No more school. All I had to wear was one suit, nothing but patches, but clean. We ate meat once a year. My Palm Beach was Hell's Kitchen. I've been working since I was 7 years old. There's nothing I didn't do. I washed clothes, I shined shoes, I picked cotton. I was a boxer, a dishwasher, a striker, and a strike breaker, yeah. I worked on the railroad, I sang the blues, I played the piano. I was an engineer, an efficiency expert, a male nurse, and informer. I was everything, yeah. You're right, it's rough and it's tough where I come from. But if you got what it takes, we'll take what you got, and then some. What do you need? A pencil, some paper, a screwdriver, a piano? You got it. You want 2 pianos? Here you are, 2 pianos. Now, goddammit, let's hear some music. If it's good, great, the sky's the limit. If you can't play, beat it. Who's next? What do you say? What do you say? Then, one day, I got my chance, and I grabbed it where it counts. And that's how I got to be... Mr. This ain't no fairy tale. Empty hands, empty pockets, that's not my style. What do you need? You don't know? Well, I'm going to tell you what you need. Thank you! To begin with, I'm going to tell you what the land of freedom's all about. No, you're not dreaming, because that land exists. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been living like pigs. Open your eyes. Open your hearts. 50% of the kids are illegitimate. How about that? Batter up? Yeah, but when they get married, man, they get married. Oh, love that hat. And dance? That's what I call rhythm. Rock it to me, baby. Yeah, Harlem. Harlem is more than a slum. It's more than a ghetto. It's a drama, a human drama. But that, too, is part of fabulous swingin' New York.
Now I use shake and bake.
The sexual revolution, the new frontier, the promised land, the permanent revolution, never before on the face of the earth. It's not for next year, it's not for tomorrow, it's for right now. It's for one and for all and all for one. Yeah, step right up, it's free and it's freedom, and there is only one freedom, and it's your freedom and it's mine, and freedom is freedom!
So obviously Mr. Freedom is this guy with the football kind of gear on, and he was telling his doctrine to the public. And the film just gets crazier and crazier, you know. You have the American embassy in a supermarket with little blonde girls jumping up and down, and then you have Mr. Chinaman, which is a dragon, and I mean, where does all this come from? I mean...
What?
All these crazy ideas, how do you get them?
How do I get them? I just look at the television.
Well, yeah, the commercial brainwashing you were talking about.
Listen,
you get a bit of this here as well.
You don't think the war in Vietnam was crazy and the war in Iraq was crazy? I mean, when you... You know, we were living in the last 20, 30 years, the craziest period of American history with the Vietnam War, with Iraq, with Bush, with Cheney and everything. I mean, what could be crazier? I mean, this is just a film.
But, I mean, now that you mention Iraq, how do you feel about the fact that your film is still so, still has so much meaning now, you know, so many years later? How do you feel about that?
Well, I feel pretty good, pretty relieved to see that it's relevant, still relevant. I think we're in a new period. I mean, there's a new Washington, there's a new president, and I think America, you know, I travel a lot, and I was very often ashamed to show my American passport, and now not. I think we have people like Obama now who makes you feel proud to be an American, and that's where I'm at now.
Okay. And so, also during your career, you had you would also tend to put your camera towards certain outcasts, so certain people who were not being filmed by other people. Like, for example, you had an interest in Muhammad Ali. You made a film on Muhammad Ali. I don't know if you can tell us how this idea came about.
Muhammad Ali is a documentary. And, you know, documentaries, you can plan them, you can hope to be able to do them. And how did I come to do a film on Muhammad Ali? It was more or less an accident. I wanted to do a film on the polarization of people in America around a heavyweight championship fight. And I grew up in the period of Joe Louis, and I knew that people, I remember how we were polarized and obsessed with these fights, you know. Everybody's waiting for Billy Conn to finally fight Joe Louis. And I remember in 1936, I was a little boy, I was 8 years old, And Joe Louis was supposed to fight Schmeling, and the odds were 10-1. And I was a great fan of Joe Louis, and I thought that Schmeling didn't have a chance. And in school, I bet 10 cents against 1 penny. Now, obviously, it was a big risk. Losing 10 cents at that time when you're 8 years old was a big deal. And all you could win was a penny. You couldn't really do much with a penny, but when you're 8 years old, with a penny you can buy licorice, you can do a whole lot of things. And anyhow, Schmeling knocked out Joe Louis. And I remembered how the whole country was really devastated by the fact that Joe Louis, who was the invincible brown bomber, Harlem was devastated. The whole country was devastated because here is this Nazi coming into America, knocking out the greatest boxer of the time. And I remember the return match. I was 8, 9 years old, and I remember how much we all were hoping against hope that Louis would revenge himself and revenge us all. And he did, he almost killed Schmeling. He knocked him out in 2 rounds, he put him in the hospital. He broke every bone in his body practically. And so I was going to America to do a film on a heavyweight championship fight. And I remember that my idea was to do a film on the polarization around a fight with Cassius Clay and Sonny Liston. And this was a crazy story because Cassius Clay was an Olympic champion. He was clean, he had nothing to do with the mafia. And Sonny Liston was a mafia bodyguard. And if there was a symbol of good and evil, Cassius Clay should have been the good and Liston the evil. But it wasn't like that. It was the contrary, because nobody could stand Cassius Clay at that time because he had never proved himself to be a really good boxer. Everybody was convinced that his fights were fixed, and the press treated him like a clown. And I knew nothing more about Cassius Clay than what I read in the newspapers. And I went to do the film anyhow, and to see how it would turn out. I was lucky because when I went down to Miami from New York, there was an empty seat in the plane, and I saw that the guy sitting next to this empty seat was Malcolm X. And nobody wanted to sit next to Malcolm X because he was very well known. He was on the cover of Life magazine, and he was the devil for Americans. And but I was curious about Malcolm X, and I sat there, and for 2.5 hours we talked, and I really could say we became friends. He was very curious about me. I mean, a Jewish filmmaker from New York, living in Paris, coming to Miami, where a future black Muslim would be fighting this hulk of Sonny Liston, and he was going to get killed, But Malcolm started to talk about things that the way he saw them, and he said all history is pointing to the victory of Cassius. He said Americans can't stand him because here's this Negro. He used the word Negro. Here's this Negro going around saying, I'm the greatest. Now, if other Negroes start saying, I'm the greatest, walking around the street, Americans can't stand this. And he filled me into a lot of things. And what's more important, he opened the door for me to be close to Ali. I was able to do everything in Ali's camp. For one thing, because of Malcolm, and secondly, because most of the press were not interested in Ali, Cassius, because they thought he was going to get killed, and he had no legitimate. He was not a legitimate challenger, and so the white press. All the journalists were fascinated by this mean Sonny Liston. They would be looking at him, you know, and they say, "This is the sort of nigger we don't want to meet in an alley in the middle of the night." And and so they weren't interested in Ali. They thought he didn't have a chance. I keep saying Ali, but they called him Cassius at that time. It's only the next day after the fight that Cassius revealed that he was a black Muslim and that his new name was Muhammad Ali. But nobody even took that seriously. You know, they said, well, who is this asshole calling himself Muhammad Ali? And nobody called him Muhammad Ali. They kept calling him Cassius. Even other boxers like Joe Frazier, he drove Ali crazy because he would not call him Muhammad Ali. But anyhow, how did I get to do this film? I say, you know, in documentaries and in movies and in life generally, there are accidents. And I happened on this beginning of a saga. This is a great American saga where this fabulous boxer and this fabulous man, Muhammad Ali, became the beginning of a legend. He won the fight in Miami in 1964 against all odds. Nobody could have, in the wildest dreams, imagined that he could knock out, or he could beat Sonny Liston. Knockout. It was a technical knockout because Sonny Liston didn't come in for the 8th round, and I mean, it was unimaginable. And for me, it was a complete surprise. The whole idea that here is this guy bucking history, bucking all the odds, bucking all the wise men of boxing and sports and everything, and proving that when he was saying I'm the greatest, he really was, because he's the greatest boxer of all time, you know, and the greatest sports figure. But Americans have realized this many years later because, you know, he became the sportsman of the century for America, and when the Americans had the Olympics in America, he was the one who lighted the Olympic flame. Here's a guy, you know, who is the greatest bullshit artist, the greatest talker in the world. He's a rapper, you know, and he could talk anybody into the ground. And nowadays he can hardly speak, you know, and he can hardly move. He was the greatest mover in boxing, and he has difficulty walking from here to there.
But how about if we see some images of him at his best moment?
Okay.
Okay.
Get him off. Where's the other one? Where's you? Come here.
Dance for it. Oh, the world is watching you. Oh, the champ. Oh, the biggest sporting event I've ever been held on the face of the earth.
I'm the champ.
Yes.
I'm the biggest thing in history.
The president of the United States.
I'm the king.
The queen is that the queen of England.
The Beatles.
King.
The Beatles.
The Beatles gave nothing but a
The Beatles bought my autograph.
Yes, they did.
I'm the king.
King of the ring.
Oh. Tell this one to cut that mustache off. I don't even shave yet.
Yeah.
Champ.
How'd Gillette go give you a commercial?
Ain't that a shame? Don't even shave.
Say you're mad because Gillette won't give you a
I'll give you a
commercial.
commercial.
Because I don't shave.
Well, I'm sorry to be rushing, but time seems
Yeah,
to
but
fly.
I couldn't imagine that I would be getting into something like that, you know. And the fact that I was there with Ali rubbing his balls backstage, and this is all thanks to Malcolm X, you know, because here I was, nobody knew me from Adam, and here I came in with my camera and my assistant and sound man, and I was doing anything I wanted, you know. And that's unheard of, you know, a heavyweight champion of the world.
Did you remain friends?
You know, I lived in Paris, and I saw him once or twice afterwards, and did we remain friends? We were never really friends, but, you know, Ali is somebody who kind of crazy, let's face it, and he did something, he played a game which was a parody of the way white men would talk about black people. You know, they would never, white men would not know black people's names, you know. They would say, "Hey, George." They would go, you know, on train and go on the dining car, and they would call the waiter and say, "Hey, George, give me some more beer," or something. And Ali made a point of not knowing the names of white reporters and everything. And he would say, with the people from Life, he would say, "Hey, Life, come here," or something. He wouldn't know the name of these guys. And he did that with me a little bit, you know. He knew I came from Europe. But he didn't know where Paris was or anything, and so you know, I came from Europe, and he called me England. And at one point in the film, you know, he says people were talking about whether he would beat Liston and in the return match, and somebody said, if the price is right, he'll win the fight. And Ali says to me, hey England, did you hear that? The price is right. I'll win the fight. He's a great poet, you know. And so were we friends? As much as you could be friends. But I was living in Paris, and it was expensive for me to go running over to America and going to Starbucks with Muhammad Ali.
I'm going to take a bit of a jump here, but I know you wanted to show an extract from the Pan-African Festival.
Yeah,
you were there 40 years ago.
This is very journalistic, because I did this film I worked on this film far from Vietnam, and the Algerian government imagined a festival called the Pan-African Cultural Festival. And they invited about 30 African countries to come and celebrate their independence. And they came with music, dance, and theater, and everything, and intellectuals, because it was a symposium. And they asked me to coordinate a big film on this Pan-African Festival. And I did it 40 years ago, in 1969. And the idea was to have, like, for Far From Vietnam, directors from all over the world collaborating. But, you know, you learn things. You think you have an idea of what's going on, but you don't. And I didn't know that the Algerians were not liked by the African countries. The Cubans, who were the great revolutionary filmmakers, documentary filmmakers, were supposed to collaborate on this film. And there was Santiago Alvarez, who was supposed to do the work on the film, but he declined. And Ousmane Sembène from Africa also refused to work with the Algerians because the Algerians were known to be racists and they weren't really appreciated by black Africans. And so I was stuck suddenly. I accepted to do this film, and we had a lot of different directors working on it, Italian, Polish, from Lotz. And I was stuck suddenly with this project, and the date of the festival was going to take place, and there was nothing I could do. I couldn't back out. So I did the film, but my idea was to, instead of having directors doing each different segment, I had the idea of having really good cameramen who were also filmmakers. Now these people exist, especially in Canada. There was a guy called Michel Brault, and he was a famous cameraman and a good director. And in France there were a couple as well, Yann Lemasson and Pierre Lhomme, and there was me. And so I had a big crew. I had 12 crews and a helicopter. And we did this, we went to Algiers, and I was knocked out by this confrontation of cultural groups from 20 different African countries. And here's a section that you're going to see, which is was the beginning of the festival. There was a parade in the main street of Algiers where there were all the different members of all the different countries who came up the boulevard. It was really one of the most extraordinary things I ever saw. And I had no idea of what really Africa was about. And when I saw this, I realized that there was the material of a film, and I did the film. What's actual is that the festival, they're doing a second festival, and the film that I did put the accent on the revolutionary liberation movements, and for some reason, you don't remember, but 40 years ago there was almost a civil war in Algiers, in Algeria, where the Muslim Islamic movements want to overthrow the government, and there was much bloodshed. And what happened was the Muslim Brothers got rid of all the people who invented this festival, and the film was blocked. You know, this happens in movies, you know, you have a film and it doesn't get distributed. And for political reasons inside Algeria, the film, which was very good, wasn't shown. And now it's being unearthed, and for the new festival, there's a tribute to this film, and my film is opening the festival with screenings outdoors and everything. That's part of the story of movies, you know.
I was wondering, you've been associated with characters like Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, Eldridge Cleaver. Do you think the FBI has a file on you?
The FBI?
Yeah,
of course.
Yes. And I mean, just before we finish...
You want to see my file?
Yeah, that'd be good, yeah. Just before we finish, because we'd like to open it to the public, well, I'd like to, we haven't spoken about this, but you have always been an independent artist. You make your posters, you do your credits. I believe you did commercial work on the side to be able to make your films, and I think this gave you much creative freedom. So I would like to know, after so many years as a filmmaker and an artist, what are your biggest satisfactions?
I think I took risks, but I don't regret them.
I'm very glad you did take those risks. I think you've left us some wonderful films that we will carry on enjoying for a long time. So...
She's such a diplomat.
What do you think? I think we could... we had a Messiah clip, but maybe we should open...
Oh, I'd love to see a Messiah clip.
We'll see the Messiah and then we'll open it up to the public, if that's okay.
Oh, shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel, God with us. O thou that tellest good tidings to Zion, get thee up into the high mountain. O thou that tellest good tidings to Zion, get thee up into the high mountain. Get thee up into the high
It's hard for you to have an idea of what the film is like, or maybe it isn't, I don't know. But the idea of the film for me, when I hear Handel, it knocks me out. I really love Handel, his music, and I thought The Messiah, which is such a masterpiece, which is the piece of music that is classical music that is most played in the history of music. But it's mostly the Hallelujah chorus that people play. Because I had somebody who was doing the research for our filming, and he was in New York, and she found in Long Island alone, there were 120 versions of the Messiah done in churches and so on for Easter or for Christmas. And so as the Hallelujah chorus mostly. But the idea was that there are people all over the world who sing the choruses from the Messiah. And I wanted to film amateur groups and the best professionals in the world. So that beautiful blonde woman in the beginning is Magdalena Kožena, who is a Czech super genius singer, and she sang, and there was a group of gay and lesbian people in Times Square in the rain, but I was able to film in a whole lot of strange places, in Spain and all over America and a lot of places. And to mix them with the best professional musicians and choir possible. Now, that beautiful blonde woman, she's a star at the Met every season. And she comes from a little town in Czechoslovakia. But the idea of mixing in amateur groups with the best professionals possible, that was the idea of the film, and I think it works.
I'm sorry, I went through it really quickly. I never said it was your last film. I was a bit nervous there. But how about if we open it up to the public now, for them to ask you some questions?
Open up to the public? You mean we talk?
Well, you talk with them, yeah.
Okay.
How about it? Who has a question?
I have two questions, I guess. The first one was, you talked about the GI Bill and going to study in Paris, and so I was curious if anyone that was in your class went on to be as successful as you. And then the second part would be, what do you think it made, this is a big question, why do you think you were so successful? Was it all the risk-taking? Was it the happy accidents that happened along the way?
Maybe my success, as far as I'm concerned, is I've always done what I wanted to do, and I never took shit from anybody. And so, but that, you know, has another side to it, because it isolates you from a whole lot of things, you know. It's hard to get financing for projects which are kind of weird.
I have a question about the first film, Broadway by Light. How did you negotiate the transition from photography to cinema?
I didn't negotiate it, you know. There are films, I mean, people talk about a film being prepared, you know, in Hollywood or in America, and there's a couple $100 million involved and so on. And that's one way that films are made. And then we're talking about France in the, when was this? In the end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s. And everybody talks about indie films, independent films being made in America, you know. In France, all the films were independent at that time with very little money. And a lot of these films were done on a shoestring. You're talking about La Jetée. Now, that's a very famous film, but Chris Marker, what did he do? He did a film without a camera. He took photographs, and he photographs his friends, and he animated these photographs, and it was a film. Now, this is a film that's known all over the world, but it was done for $2, you know, $2 Chuck, and so we're talking about a period when people who wanted to do a film, they could do the films, and they weren't such a big deal. There wasn't much money, there wasn't much financing or distribution, but the films got done, and some of them became like icons. A film like La Jetée, but the films get done, and they stay, and people relate to them, and they have influences like what's the name of the film by Terry Gilliam that was inspired by the
12 Monkeys.
The 12 Monkeys, what?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 12 Monkeys.
Yeah, and Terry Gilliam was inspired by La Jetée to do a super production. So, you know, movies, there are people like Rimbaud, you know, who scrawls a few lines, and it's a poem that influences people all over the world for generations. So movies are like that also, can be like that.
We've heard a lot about your films in terms of opportunity that just happened. You were in the right place with people having confidence in you, and your willingness to be on the edge of exploring these crazy ideas and not putting up with bullshit. But what are your disappointments if you were to look back? Have you any setbacks that you find yourself saying that, I mean, we've heard about all these exciting, wonderful things, that's fabulous, but is there something that you want to share with us tonight about a particular disappointment that looms, or you just move forward and you don't ever dwell on that?
All of my films were setbacks. I'm not kidding. I always felt that my films didn't get enough distribution, and there were all kinds of problems with the films. But you know, I always felt there are a whole lot of films I wanted to do, and I would have liked to have the possibility of doing them, but what are you talking about? Sex fest. I don't feel that I'm successful as far as the movies are concerned.
Okay, just follow up on that.
I'm doing these offbeat movies that a lot of not many people see.
Could you say a little bit about how you work with other cameramen? Because unless you're the sole cameraman, the actual technique on the set that you use.
How do I work with another camera? I mean, I usually film things myself, but you know, cameramen, they speak the same language that you do, and you could get through to a guy, and explain what you want and get what you want from somebody else who knows what he's doing. It's not impossible.
And do you improvise? They were saying.
I improvise a lot, yeah. Like we're doing tonight.
And the editing, they're saying, how is the editing of your films?
How is the editing?
Yes, you
it's
have
okay.
an editor,
it's okay.
and do you, I mean, do you ask for very specific things, or do you leave some freedom for the editor?
Yeah, I never understood how they work in Hollywood, where a guy is shooting a film, the old system of Hollywood, you know. The guy is shooting a film, then he goes on to a next film, and meanwhile the editor is putting the film together. I never understood how that's done. I don't understand.
So you're always next to your editor?
I'm always sitting next to the editor, so I actually do the editing.
So you did films on Eldridge Cleaver, you did a film on Muhammad Ali, you did a film on, well, you didn't do a film on Malcolm X, but you were associated with all these people, and you were, through your association, aware of the country at the time and the mood regarding race at the time. And now a new president has been elected to the country, and as an expatriate living in Paris, how did you respond to that?
How did I react to that?
Yeah.
I thought it was the greatest thing I ever saw.
But based on your experience with all these other people, and
I mean, it's incredible, you know. I live in Paris, you know, and we couldn't believe that there would be a president of the United States like Bush, who could hardly speak English, who was somebody, you know, who you wouldn't elect as dog catcher. And he was running the most powerful country in the world, and running it into the ground, actually, because, I mean, imagining a war in Iraq is so amazing. How do I feel about Obama being president? I feel great. I thought I would never really have faith in America, and now I do. And Obama makes me feel like that. And Obama is not alone. I mean, it's so amazing the way he raised money with all these kids who would be running from door to door and going on the web and getting a contribution of $10, $15, $20 and making more money than all these big machines. I'm amazed by all that.
Broadway by Light seems to so influence American filmmakers. It seems like the opening, so many sequences in Taxi Driver owe such a great debt to that film. Have you had a chance to talk to other filmmakers about the influence of your work?
Well, you know, I live in Paris. I come here from time to time, and here I am, and I hear people talking and reacting, and I learn a lot from listening to people, and I was in a situation like this, I remember, and there was in the university, there was a presentation of my films, and there was an exhibition, and there was a guy got up, an African American, I find that hard to say actually, got up and said, "Mr. Klein, what is your philosophy?" And everybody laughed, and I laughed too. And then I thought a second, and I said, you know, here I am in a university, and I remember going to school when I was a kid, and every day we had to make the Pledge of Allegiance. Did you do that? Yeah. In the Pledge of Allegiance, they say, one country, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And I said, you know, we said this by rote when we were kids. We didn't even know what we were talking about. But I felt, if there's something I can believe in, is that one country, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. What more can you ask?
I can ask one one really fast question too. Blow Up and Paulina came out at the same time. Did you ever talk to Antonioni when...
To who?
Antonioni, but Blow Up and Paulina came
No,
out.
I worked with Fellini. You don't know that? No, I went when I was a groupie of Fellini, and when I did my book on New York, he was in Paris. He came to Paris to bring out I Vitelloni, and I called him up. In those days, you could do that. I called him up in his hotel, and I said, "Mr. Fellini, please," and they said, "One moment, please," and they put me on to him. And I said, "Look, I just did a book on New York, which I think you might be interested in. I'd like to show it to you and give it to you." And he said, "Come tomorrow at 4. And I went, and we talked. I gave him the book, and he said, "You know, there's an Italian edition of this book, and I have it on my night table, and I really dig it. Why don't you come to Rome and be my assistant?" And I said, "What does an assistant do?" He said, "No problem. If I'm sick, you film." And then I went to Rome immediately. I said, "When does the film start?" He said, "In 2 weeks." And so I went there with my wife, and I had a friend who lent me his apartment. And I started to work with Fellini, but the film was delayed. Giulietta broke her leg. His father died. There were about 8 people who had 25% of the film, and there were all kinds of problems. But I started to work with him a little bit. It was the Nights of Cabiria, and the project at that time was finding enough whores to work in the film. And so I went around with him. We photographed these whores and pimps and so on. And that was the only time I really worked with a director. I was never an assistant, but I was in Rome and the film was delayed, and I knew some people in Rome who could help me on a project I sort of invented, which was to do a book on Rome. I'd done a book on New York, so I did a book on Rome. I started taking photographs, but I mean, Fellini was the only guy. You talk about Antonioni. I hardly knew him.
Well, then we'll just have to give you a round of applause.
Huh?